Join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Nichole Oocumma. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that was terrible. Good afternoon. Yes, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Nichole Oocumma. I am excited to be here to talk to you about inclusive leadership. When I leave today's session, what I'm going to do is challenge you to be bold. I was invited to talk to you a little bit about inclusive leadership here because for many years, we have focused on creating diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging programs within our organization. In the most recent years, we've even gone as far as denouncing racism, taking pledge and making commitments to equity and inclusion, and really working to include that in our organization. We've been very purposeful to talk about D, E, I, and B in our conversations, to include them in our practices and the way we hire, the way we recruit. And even when we look at data, we've been really thoughtful about D, E, and I, and B. But I'm wondering, what are we doing in our communities, and how is that reflected within our organizations? And so when it comes to D, E, I, and B, and I put some definitions there in case you're wondering the difference, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about inclusion, because we all have good intentions around diversity programming, but our intentions don't always match our outcomes. And why is that? There's research that was cited in the Harvard Business Review that says 3/4 of our underrepresented employees do not feel like our programs have made a difference for them in our organization. So what really makes people feel included in our organizations? What makes them feel like they belong, that they're valued? It could be our mission, our policies, our practices. It could be the opportunities that we put in front of our employees. Maybe it's the coworkers, right? My coworkers' behaviors, do those make me feel more included? And I would say yes, all of those things are true, but what's most important is us as leaders. This is what's going to change how our companies exist. And so over the last 20 years, we've become really good at becoming leaders or being leaders in a homogenistic environment. But as the world is changing, especially in the last 3 years, everything's been accelerated. We have to show up differently to be successful. That means that we need to show up with a new capability. We need to be different in how we are executing leadership today. And I think that adjustment is inclusive leadership. We need to adjust. And I'm not really suggesting a wholesale approach to leadership, that we get rid of things like transformative leadership and authentic leadership and servant leadership. Those are all still important. But within each one of those leadership theories, there's a piece that we haven't spent as much time on, and that's inclusion. What does it look like for us to build relationships, to really understand the people in our organization? What kind of leader will we need to be successful in 5 years, in 8 years, in 15? And the reason why I'm asking you that is to think about it. In just 5 years, it's going to be 2028, right? 10 years. What about in 2038? That feels like a long way away, but it's not. It's just 15 years away. And with all this attention to doing the right thing within our organizations, we also have to do the right things ourselves. We have to be able to reinvent our approach. And leaders who embrace inclusive leadership styles are the ones that are going to lead the way. So, inclusive leadership is different. Research at Deloitte showed that companies with an inclusive culture are more likely to have 2 times better financial situations. They are 3 times more likely to be considered high-performing and 6 times more likely to be innovative. What? We're already innovative. I'm already high-performing. Our finances made it through the pandemic. We're good to go. But we're always seeking a way to be better. We're always seeking a way to be better. So what does this mean? Inclusive leaders are aware of their own biases. If you have a brain, you have bias. So we're all aware of our own biases, and we actively seek out opportunities to understand the different perspectives that other people that are different than us bring to the table. This is not easy. And so as an inclusive leadership, ultimately it comes down to us making connections, for us considering the differences of those in the room. It really is an opportunity for us to really accept and value people's differences while accepting them as part of our group. Research also offers that only 1 in 3 leaders holds an accurate view of their inclusive leadership skills. 1 in 3 leaders believe they are more inclusive than those around them would say. And then there's another third that says, I'm not sure. I lack a little confidence because inclusive leadership is requiring me to be bold. I need to step out. I'm not sure I can do that. So I want you to look to your left and then look at the person on your right. Which one are you? Which one are you? I don't know. So it's really important to be thoughtful about what that looks like for me. We have hired, and we recruit, and we invite to a committee 1 Black person, 1 young person, 1 older person, 1 LGBTQ person on our team or within our department. And we've done it. We've got diversity. That's been our minimum standard. That's been our minimum standard for diversity. And you're like, Nichole, this doesn't feel good. This does not feel good. And I'm saying, you're right. But if we don't know if our programs are making a difference, if we don't have true measures of making a difference, if people are telling us, I don't know if your program's making a difference, then maybe we should move away from measurement. And I'm going to encourage you to not pay attention to the measures, how many people are different in the room, but instead pay attention to your behavior when there are different people in the room. I'm going to say that to you one more time. I think we should shift from measuring the differences to paying attention to our behavior in the presence of those differences. So, inclusive leadership requires us to be empathetic. Easy, right? We understand empathy even from a broad perspective. It's the foundation of us making connections with people at an emotional level. It's an act. It should show. When people are empathetic, we're like, they are empathetic. We can see it. And when we are empathetic, it allows us to make meaningful connections, whatever that means to you or to the other people in the room. And so as an organization, if we can commit to merging empathy and inclusion, we have an opportunity to change our organization's environment, to create a meaningful environment for which all of our employees work and live. I'm going to tell you that we generally understand what empathy, a broad view, everybody's got it. I don't need to explain it. But what's this inclusive leadership? You know, you were invited, Nichole, to talk about inclusive leadership. I got it. I understand what empathy is. But what is inclusive leadership? What does it look like? And before I dig into the behaviors, I'm going to talk to you about 6 behaviors of inclusive leadership, give you some opportunities to think about where you sit and what that looks like. I want to call out that you do not have to have the title of leader to move the needle. You don't have to have the title. You can be an informal leader, a team leader, a committee chair, a board member, activist, an intern. You don't just need to be the CEO, the president, the chief, a chair, an elected official, a director, or a manager to make a difference. And that is all of us. That's really all of you. All of you have the opportunity to be different. All right, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about inclusive leadership and how you can start to change your behaviors to be an inclusive leader. And these are the 6 behaviors that I'm going to share how and what you can do so that you can start to practice differently and change what your organization looks like. The first one, self-awareness, social awareness, listening to understand, creating connections, courageous vulnerability, and active investing. All right, the first one, deepen your self-awareness. Before you can do anything, we must all master self-awareness. We must understand our own biases. We must understand our strengths, our weaknesses, and we must be comfortable in our own skin. This is an ongoing focus. We're just not self-aware one day. And if any of you tell me, oh gosh, I got number 1 down, I'm self-aware, Nichole, I'm good. What's number 2? I'm going to argue that you are wrong. That you are wrong. This is something that we work on every day. Is there a certain group of people that you automatically think a certain way? Older people, oh, older people. Younger people, oh, younger people. Right? We automatically think, what about a person with an accent? A person in a wheelchair? Our brains automatically think a certain way. We have natural biases. And so I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to pause a minute before I keep going to the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th behavior, and I want to talk to you a little bit about bias. If you have a brain, again, you have bias. We all have bias. Unconscious bias does not equal any ism, right? This is just our brain's way of having mental associations that we have no purposeful thought about. If I say peanut butter, everybody just thought jelly. Your brain just goes there. It just goes there. There is no reason for why that happens, except we have spent years taking the bits of information from our brain, and every interaction, our brain brings those forward and then says, this is familiar, this is unfamiliar, this is safe, this is not safe. I like it, I don't like it. And we make those determinations within seconds without any purposeful thought. And so with that, it's really important for you to think about that. Have you ever met someone that reminds you of your grandmother? Or like a friend, a really good friend, and you just get that automatic affinity to that person, right? What about that mean 7th grade teacher? And you're like, ugh, they remind me of that teacher. Or that know-it-all neighbor. Ugh, she reminds me of this neighbor I used to have, let me just tell you. But we automatically start thinking in this way about that. And to our brain, similarity means safety, differences equal threat. And so our brain is trying to figure that all the time. And inclusive leaders are aware that our biases can narrow our vision, and they can make our decision-making not match our intent. Not match our intent. We have years of conditioning from media, news images, and I'm not talking about the last few years. Let's not actually even talk about the last few years, but just our whole life of news, media, the conversations we have with friends and family, the people we grew up with, the people we've been exposed to or not exposed to. Our education, the type of education, the location of the education, the quality of the education. It all drives the way our brains work. But it's our brain's way of naturally making associations based on that so that what we see is not what our brain is always telling us. And what my brain tells me when I see something is different than what your brain tells you when you see the exact same thing. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to have a QR code for you, so hopefully you have a smartphone. I'm going to have a QR code for you that's going to allow you to take the Harvard Implicit Bias Association test. I don't know if anybody's ever taken that test before. And it's a great exercise in self-awareness. And there's lots of different tests within there that you can take and practice. And with that test, it's really important for you to think about it. if you score low and your unconscious bias is high, it doesn't mean that you've overtly committed any ism or hurt any person. It means that your unconscious brain is already making those decisions. And consciously, it's going to be like, no, that test didn't work, and that's not true. This is our unconscious brain, right, that's telling us this is the way it works. So let me tell you a story about me. Several years ago, I was interviewing for a position, and I just could not find the right one. I couldn't find the right person, the right experience, someone that I liked, the right fit, and I was tired of interviewing. We've all been there. If you have any responsibility for hiring, you're like, oh, interviewing. It's tiring. It's difficult because you're looking for that right person. Well, my talent acquisition director came to me. She's a friend of mine, and she's like, Nichole, I have the perfect person for you. The perfect person. She's been interning with us for 6 months. She graduates in a couple weeks. I was like, oh no. I cannot train someone. I need someone with experience in this role. Right? And that was my first thought. And she said, Nichole, you have to meet her. You have to. And since she was my friend, I said yes. And you know what? I hired her. I loved her from the first moment I met her. And then what made it even better is I observed that she could handle the room with executives, with physicians, with community leaders and her coworkers, and she wasn't afraid to stand up and give her opinion. And she was 20. Right. See, your brain's already showing your bias. But what I also noticed is people were approaching her in that same way I had. Our biases were showing. Our biases were showing. I was not, and they were not, creating an environment that was open to diversity and that was inclusive for her. Long story short, she's 31 now, but she was the best hire I ever had, and not because she did a good job, but she brought some self-awareness to my own biases. She enabled me to think about where I was coming and how I was approaching people and the opportunities that I was and was not giving people in looking for that right person, the right experience with the right fit. All right, so social awareness alone is not enough. Sorry, self-awareness alone is not enough. We have to foster social awareness. Well, what does this mean? This is us looking at the people that we interact with. This is us trying to understand who we interact with. So first comes personal awareness, and this comes social awareness. This is how we show up. This is a leader's currency. People are judging you by your social awareness. This is the currency that we have, right? People who don't have social awareness, they say the wrong thing at the wrong time, right? We know those people. We have all been those people, right? And so it's really important to have that social awareness. People who are socially aware are consistent, they're authentic. These are folks we say, oh man, they are fair. Even when we don't like what they're doing, we have that feeling authenticity because they have social awareness. The third one here, listening to understand. This is different than active listening. This is paying attention to the person who's speaking their values, their beliefs, their feelings, their thoughts, their perspective, and opening yourself up to that as you're making some decisions. So we're listening. And those who have the ability to really understand people's stories and to share their own stories in that communication have more inclusive relationships. They are really able to build those relationships without much thought. We can still be successful and take some time to get to know people. We don't have to go directly to the agenda, right? And if you're a person like me, let's get it done. You have to take the time to build relationships, because if we can pause, understand where someone else is coming from, someone else's story, we actually make better decisions because we've been more thoughtful, we've challenged our own thinking. The next one, create connections. That's our fourth act of inclusive leadership. This is making purposeful connections with other people. It sounds a little bit like the last two, but no, this is actively going out. So let me tell you another story. I'll give you an example. I went to the Kroger in Dublin on High Street just a few weeks ago. And when I went into that Kroger, I remember thinking, gosh, this was the Kroger that me and my friends used to walk to after school and track practice to get a snack. I was like, oh, I haven't been here in a while. I just needed to get a couple of things. And when I got to the register, I heard this man talking about the 1919 building. And I was like, oh. And my brain took a step towards this man. And then I said, are you talking about the 1919 building? And for those of you who aren't aware or who weren't around Dublin 40 years ago, the 1919 building was the high school and the middle school. I think there's like 4 or 5 high schools in Dublin now. And so he said yes. And I smiled and I took another step closer to him. My introvert self went away and I asked, what year did you graduate? And he said 1986, and I was like, 1986! That is fantastic. And my brain took another step closer to him again. And the cashier, the young cashier, she said, what high school did you guys go to? And we both looked at each other and we kind of laughed because that was the only high school 40 years ago. And we laughed, and he said that was the only high school back then. For those of you who don't know, Dublin used to be a farm town. Dublin used to be a farm town. And so we stood there for a little bit, and I talked, and he said, what year did you graduate? And I'm not going to give you a chance to do any math in this room, but I told him, and he said, that was the year my sister graduated. And I took another step closer to him. And then he said, you were the last class to graduate from the 1919 building before they built Dublin High School. Dublin High School is now Kaufman High School, for those of you who are aware of Dublin, right? It wasn't Dublin Kaufman when we were there. It was just the high school. And when he said that, my brain took another step closer to him, right? And then we talked for a little bit longer. He was done at the register, and he went to walk away, and he turned around, and for a moment, I thought we were going to hug, and then my brain was like, oh, hold up. We're not that close. And I think his brain did the same thing. Instead, he waved and smiled, and I smiled, and then I walked away, and I was smiling for the rest of the day. And why am I telling you this story? You're like, Nichole, I don't care. You went to Kroger, so what? But what if that same interactions were happening in our workplace? If we were looking for spaces to engage people we wouldn't normally talk to. My brain was building a connection with a man that looked very different than me. And for those of you who are around Dublin, there's not as many people like me in Dublin, and there wasn't that many 40 years ago. And so I am building a connection with someone who's very different than me. Imagine if that happened in our workplaces. If that could happen in our workplaces, we would have a whole different level of connection, right? We could talk to people that someone we would never have engaged with otherwise. And then we can train our brain to have more safe spaces. Our brain will see that bits of information from that experience at Kroger and allow me to engage with others. The next one here is courageous vulnerability. This means that we are, I just got the 5-minute mark. A courageous vulnerability is us, let me get my brain back on here, is where we candidly speak up, where we are in different environments and we have the bravery and the courage to speak up. That's courageous vulnerability. If we can speak up and reveal our own limitations in the space with others, then we can continue to grow. And finally, the last one I'll tell you here is actively investing. This is in the resources and practices of our organization. And so let me show you an ad. Have any of you seen this Dove product? It's changed. This was in 2014. Can you see what I have circled there? So what's normal? What's abnormal? Here's Dove again in 2017. Another miss? If you think about ads from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, yeah, it was a miss. And so Dove came out and said, oh my gosh, we're sorry. And the next day, they updated the ad, and we're like, oh, we're good. And look, October 9th, 2 days later, and they were like, oh, we're so sorry. We are so sorry. We are so sorry. Now, the Dove that we know today still has the same ad. There's tagline is, real women. Dove is good for every skin type and every skin tone and every woman, no matter the woman. Every woman, right? So Dove is an extreme example, but if decisions are not made in an inclusive environment where people with differences are open to speaking up, then the intention of the Dove Real Women ad doesn't match the outcome. So we're living in this global environment of diversity. The millennials are taking over our workplaces. They're at 50%. We have this diverse population within our workplaces. People are more mobile. They're more educated. They're working from home. We have access to all of this, so we can do good stuff. But if we don't get the people part right, we're not going to be successful. All right. So this is where it gets complicated. I've got one more story. Kristen's going. All right. If you know Kirsten, she'll keep me in line. But this is where it's most important. Because you say, what can I do to get started in building my leadership environment, inclusive leadership in the environment for which I work? Well, I'm going to tell you one more story. And this is that if you think about our environments, right? We think about the world, and we get to a space where the majority group becomes our norms. It becomes part of our culture. This is the way they're somewhat invisible. This is the way we work. This is the way it is. And so, left-handed people in the room, right? You know what I'm talking about. This world is not built for left-handed people. The mouses, our computer mouses, scissors, right? That darn spiral on those notebooks are not built for right people, but look how many right people there are. Why do we need to make a difference? So if you think about this in the case of an interview, I'm hiring some people to cut a straight line. But don't worry, I brought scissors. I brought the same scissors, my scissors. I got good scissors. Everybody wants to use my scissors. They were kind of expensive scissors. They are good scissors. I'm going to bring those to the interview. Now, if I brought my scissors, we're good to go, everybody's using the same scissors, do the left-handed interviewees speak up? Or do they just adapt? And since I'm looking for the straightest line, am I more likely to hire right-handed people? Am I more likely to promote right-handed people because they're like me? Not on purpose, but my unconscious brain is looking for that straight line. So inclusive leaders know that fairness does not equal sameness. Fairness does not equal sameness. All right, so I want you to consider, one, at the end of this presentation, I'm gonna have a second QR code for you, because I want you to establish a baseline for your own inclusive self. So take the test. I'm not asking you to argue with it. I don't even want to argue with you. Just take the test. Figure out what your baseline is. Then I want you to approach a few people in your circle and have a conversation and ask them to be your personal advocates and help you get better. I want you to then be very, very bold. Be very, very bold. If this Dr. Hooden, if Francis Hooden worked at Dove, do you think they would have had that problem? They would not have had that same problem. So what's next? Think about these 6 behaviors. I've talked about the I, inclusive, self-awareness, social awareness, listening to understand, creating connections, courageous vulnerability, active listening. But what I really want you to do is just be bold. Just be bold. So you can work on all those 6 things. You can create your personal environment. You can put yourself in uncomfortable situations. But at the end of the day, you have to examine yourself. Examine your organization. Do people look like you on your team? Do you know your people's stories? Are your biases showing up in interviewing and hiring? Does your organization have scissors for everyone? Or do we all have to carry the same pair? Am I measuring you on the use of my scissors? Or am I measuring you on the straight line? So I want you to think about that when you come into your organization. Examine who is within your organization and think about those biases. And then establish inclusive leadership as a core competency. I want to thank you for my time. I know I went over, but I want to thank you so much for having me here today. Oh, where's my QR codes? Oh man, we'll have to get those to you. I thought they were my last slide, but my slide is gone. We'll get those up for you. No worries. I feel so awesome.